Welcome to Optimal, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dickon Weatherby, and this podcast and my website all focus on one thing, and that's the quest for optimal health. Our goal is to help your patients achieve optimal health so they can experience an optimal life. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. And also make sure to go over to optimaldx.com and check out our resources on the site. Now, without any further delay, is today's episode. Well, hello and welcome everyone. Dr. Dickon Weatherby here from Optimal DX, and want to welcome you to another episode of Optimal, the podcast, joined as usual by Beth Ellen in Naples, Florida. Hi, Beth. How are things?
Hello. They're doing very well, thank you.
You're holding up the East Coast. I'll hold up the West Coast. It's raining right now, which is nice. We need some rain. It's very green and lush, but it'll soon be brown and hopefully not too smoky out where we are. But anyway, today's topic is something that we've sort of been mulling over for a while. And it really is, I wanted to dive into this whole concept of modifiable risk factors and really wanting to spend some time discussing with you, Beth, this concept that lifestyle choices are modifiable risk factors, and recognizing, obviously, that the work we do at Optimal DX, a lot of it is about identifying risk. What is your risk of developing cardiovascular disease? What is your risk of developing blood sugar dysregulation? So it's around risk analysis on some parts. And then so backing away from that. So if you have risk and we have a way of showing whether or not someone is moving into a more risk of a particular condition, recognizing that there are certain risks that are modifiable, and lifestyle choices can become risk factors, obviously. If you smoke, that's a lifestyle choice. Some might say, well, it's an addiction, therefore, do I really have much choice? Absolutely, you have a choice because there are treatments to get over your addiction to smoking. But that choice that you're making around your lifestyle to smoke becomes a pretty major freaking risk factor in my mind.
Oh, yeah.
But I think it's also important to remember that the choices that our patients make and the choices and the things that we put in front of our patients in order to make change are modifiable. So the unhealthy choices would include not moving your body, not sleeping very well, erratic sleep patterns, smoking, as we just talked about, excess alcohol intake, poor diet, toxin exposure. Although, toxin exposure can be one of those things. It's like, well, if I'm low income and my housing choices put me in a position where I can't get away from the toxin exposure, is that a modifiable choice? Maybe not. So we have to be, I think, a little sensitive in terms of...
But supporting the body's detoxification of those toxins could be a modifiable choice.
Absolutely. Yes. But the unhealthy choice to expose oneself to toxins may or may not be a choice that you can actually have control over, but we'll still put it in there as an unhealthy choice. And then also ineffective stress management. And I think that's also really important. So on the one hand, so I'm thinking about, we've got the scale, right? So we've got the scale, and I'm always talking about what is the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's like, well, you've got all these unhealthy choices and you might feel okay. And then suddenly you're exposed to mold and bam, it's enough to take you over. So you think, oh, it's the mold's fault. Well, it's not. It's the fact that you're not moving, you don't sleep very well, you're smoking, you drink too much, you have a poor diet, and you don't take care of your stress. It just happened that you had maybe a genetic predisposition to be able to overcome those things in a certain way. And this mold exposure was the thing that tipped you over the balance.
The tilt, they call it. Toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. Something can push you right over the edge.
Absolutely. So when you take those unhealthy choices, either alone or together, then we know that they contribute to the things that we're trying to measure in ODX, oxidative stress, the disruptions to physiology that can be seen in blood sugar dysregulation, cardiovascular risk, immune suppression, liver problems, gallbladder issues, kidney issues. And then what that leads to is metabolic biomarkers that are out of balance, and then moving into chronic disease. So really, ultimately, it's around these choices. So
until somebody finally gets a diagnosis, right? All these things are building up to that. And then boom, you have a diagnosis. And that's when sometimes, traditionally, it's time to deal with things. But we want to do that before someone gets that diagnosis.
Yeah, but how much the time when someone gets that diagnosis, and I'll raise my hand, I've probably been in this position too, and I've definitely seen it in family members, is I think deep down, we might know that the unhealthy choices that we choose to do, like lack of physical activity, don't sleep very well, things that we do, and then we get this diagnosis, let's say it's arthritis. I can speak, I have arthritis, and maybe I would look at, well, maybe I should just take a drug. That would magically get rid of my arthritis, because rather than making those choices to change my lifestyle or remove those risk factors that are not working in my best interest, I would prefer to keep doing those things and then take this drug.
But they're presented with that option, though, a lot of times. They're not presented with the option of even changing lifestyle habits. They're presented with the option of take this pill. This should solve it. That nothing else is offered to people sometimes.
Right. So let's take an example. And this is probably a very common diagnosis that people get. Maybe they've assessed through ODX and the metabolic syndrome, or blood sugar dysregulation comes up really strongly. So let's take a look at metabolic syndrome as an example. So what would be some of the modifiable risk factors that you would think around metabolic syndrome, for instance, that patients may not think that they have necessarily a choice or control over, but we who maybe know a little bit more do recognize those. So what would you think are some of the modifiable risk factors that are around?
Well, blood pressure. Sometimes elevated blood pressure is a lifestyle result, but sometimes there could be something underlying it that doesn't, is not going to be affected. But elevated blood pressure, you have to try dietary approaches first. So that's definitely modifiable.
So what dietary, you're a nutritionist and you work very, very closely with diet. So what sort of dietary changes would be the first thing that you would put on, let's say?
Well, the first thing, and I don't just tell people, get away from the salt, because then they could just continue to eat processed foods that don't have a lot of salt in it. And that's not really the direction to go in. I always push the DASH diet because I don't think people even realize the name, what it stands for is Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. The DASH diet is such a simple thing. Every physician, every healthcare practitioner should offer that to their patients if they have high blood pressure, because the DASH diet can lower blood pressure as effectively as meds in a lot of people. So definitely the DASH diet, which is, again, based on whole unprocessed food. So you got to eliminate a lot of the processed foods that have the extra salt. And a lot of people are sensitive to salt and their blood pressure will increase with salt exposure, but some people are not. So it's not just reducing salt, it's reducing the processed foods and introducing the whole foods. And fruits and vegetables are a huge factor, as we know, and enough potassium and enough magnesium and not too much sodium is one of the key factors. And that's one of the underlying premises of the DASH diet. So getting the minerals in there that help you lower your blood pressure and introducing the healthier foods, a lot of times will push out the other foods, and introduce the whole foods, unprocessed foods, and push out the processed foods. So the simple DASH diet, especially fruits and vegetables, and a super salad we talk about, we have a blog post about it. Introduce a super salad at least 3 times a week and get people used to that, where they have fruits and vegetables and lean protein and a healthy carbohydrate all in one dish. There's nothing easier than that. And that's one way to push people towards actually translating the DASH diet into something that's right there on your plate. So the DASH diet is a simple thing to just let people know it's out there and give them the overview and then translate it into some dietary choices.
Now, I'd imagine that the second modifiable risk factor is actually part of the diagnostic criteria is elevated blood sugar levels. So I would imagine that super salad, that dietary approach to lowering or helping to lower elevated blood pressure would also have a side benefit for some of these other areas that are modifiable risk factors, like the blood sugar relationship, the insulin resistance, the dyslipidemia, the low HDL, the high triglycerides that are all actually part of the syndrome that is called metabolic syndrome. What other aspects do you think that are modifiable and the approaches that we can recommend?
The blood glucose I like to address because there are little quick things like the fiber in the super salad and even extra fiber added to the meal will slow down how quickly those carbohydrates get converted into blood sugar. So fiber at the meal and even adding psyllium fiber, they did some studies that it reduced the blood glucose spikes after a meal. But walking after a meal, if anybody does have hyperglycemia or blood glucose regulation issues, walk after the meal because that will pull some of that blood glucose right into the muscle without the need for insulin. You could be insulin resistant and then the muscle's not taking in the glucose that they need. So walking after meals is a big one. And then just, of course, regulating the amount of carbohydrate throughout the day and having mixed meals. Because as soon as you have a mixed meal, it changes the glycemic load of a meal.
Right.
People get caught up in that glycemic index, and that's so specific, and it's so specific to certain foods and certain servings of food and individual foods on an empty stomach. The glycemic index isn't really that useful in real life, because also as soon as you mix a meal, it changes the glycemic index, as I said, and load of the whole meal. So mixed meals are important, and spreading carbohydrate throughout the day and walking after meals. So little things, unless somebody with type 1 diabetes or insulin dependent diabetes, obviously there are things they can do to help, but they still have to have that insulin. But usually with type 2 diabetes or obesity induced blood glucose dysregulation, these little things can help. These little factors can help.
Yeah. And then just sort of finishing off the list of those modifiable risks, I look at increased waist circumference and or waist to height ratios and things like that. Clearly, the first approach would be to really analyze what are your patients eating. That's why I really do like diet diaries. People don't like doing them, but it's like, it is important to see and catalog what people are putting into their mouths. And it's everything. It's every little candy bar. It's every little snack. It's every little peanut that they might
every
have.
Taste.
Every taste. Because when you can analyze that across, maybe a week, then you really can get a sense of what can we modify in this person's diet that would have an incredible benefit to what they're doing.
Because you need concrete action. You need a concrete action, a specific thing someone can change. And it's an awareness too. When people start to write down what they're eating, it's such an awareness exercise. Because a lot of people don't realize they take that bite of this or a bite of somebody else's food, or you're tasting while you're cooking, or you have an extra serving or something. Once you start to write that down, the awareness, a lot of times will change people's behavior automatically.
Well, I tell you what, I did a program. I lost 50 pounds about a year and a bit ago. Took 4 or 5 months of very, very strict watching what I ate, and I cataloged everything I put in my mouth. I actually used this app on my phone and was looking at all the calories. And what I realized at that time is, as a society, specifically here in the United States, and I would say probably over in Europe as well, we eat too much. We really
too much
do.
junk, not enough good.
It's not just that, we just eat too much.
Volume.
And it's just volume, and volume equals calories, and calories, we know the story from there. But I grew up and I went to boarding school when I was 8, and you had to eat everything on your plate. It's
my goodness.
But we didn't have that much food at boarding school anyway, so we always did. But it was always a thing. And I think it probably my parents, obviously grew up right at the end of the war in England, and food was scarce. And so my grandparents made sure that what food was on your plate, you ate. So translate that coming over to the United States, where portions at a restaurant or wherever are usually twice what they would have been when I was growing up. And of course, being the good boy, I would eat everything on my plate. And so surely over the time, I put on weight.
Even good food, that's true. Yep.
Anyway, we digress. So what we know about metabolic syndrome is that there are these modifiable risk factors that are part of this syndrome: elevated blood pressure, elevated blood glucose, insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, increased waist circumference, and or waist to height ratio. And what we know is that when these cluster of these conditions show up, and we track this in the ODX platform, it represents a high risk not only for diabetes, but we also know cardiovascular disease and cognitive dysfunction. So diet obviously is one of those very modifiable things. We get to choose what we put in our mouths, right? No one's forcing us to eat anything. We might have an addiction that predisposes us to want to eat certain things, but ultimately the choice of what you put in your mouth is
who's putting your hand in your mouth? We always have control over that hand.
yeah, exactly. So what other risk factors do you think that we could talk about that are modifiable, and talk about some things so that the practitioner listeners to this podcast can go, I never thought about that as a modifiable risk factor. And we could introduce some ideas of things that could change that.
Stress, right? Stress. Or how we react to stress. Sometimes we can't control stress itself, right? But we can change how we react to it. Do we recognize there are stresses, and what are they in our lives? And I think that's a big one, because people just go along just full steam ahead. This is my life. I have to deal with it. They're stressed out. They're doing everything for everybody, but they don't realize that those are actually choices too. And how you deal with your daily burden of tasks and chores and things like that, or the stresses that come our way that can just knock you off your feet. How are you going to deal with that? So I just actually updated a blog too on that. Fight, flight, freeze, or even fawn was another reaction to stress. Some people just kind of get catatonic and they stay still. Yeah. And they can't deal with it. So there are different things, and it can be working with someone that's, a professional in this area, or just doing quickie little things like walking after, if you had a fight with somebody or had something very stressful, take a long walk before you decide how you're going to deal with a certain problem. Deep breathing, stretching, regular routines, like stretch routines or going to yoga regularly. If you put that into your daily or weekly routine, when the big stresses come along, you kind of have that to fall back on. If you're used to doing deep breathing or meditation at a certain time during the day, you can really look forward to that as one of the things that helps you cope with stress as it comes up. So I would definitely say reaction, or how we cope with stress, is modifiable. And it takes practice.
So you mentioned that you updated one of our blog posts. We'll put it in the show notes so you can.
Yes. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. All the different ways that you can react to stress.
And we also put out a white paper on stress too. So if you want to go download that as well on the blog. So I feel like we've done stress quite a bit, but I absolutely think that it is a modifiable risk factor. I think one of the interesting things is the 4-part breath, like box breathing. You inhale for 4, count to 4, you hold for a count of 4, you breathe out for a count of 4, and you hold.
Hold out for a count of 4 too. Yeah.
It is extraordinary what that will do to your will switch off your cortisol response. So much so that I was reading an article, like a Navy SEAL wrote, about how he would deal with stress situations when he's out in the battlefield. And he did box breathing, 4-part, which of course is an ancient Indian.
Like the first meditation. I thought that was like the first form of meditation. Yeah, absolutely. That we recognize.
Pranayama breathing. So it's so funny how these ancient techniques, yoga, asana, breathing, everyone's into sound baths, and it's like all of these things. Well, they've been practicing that over in India for thousands of years.
Yes,
we in the West sort of take them on and go, gosh, now they're ours. No, we need to give credit where credit's due.
Give them credit,
We can obviously measure stress from a biomarker perspective. So we do have a stress algorithm that we look at, but biomarkers for stress can be monitored over time. As a practitioner, we can get like a little window into, you might have a patient that's sitting in front of you that doesn't appear to be stressed, but when you look at their blood biomarkers, you go, whoa, something. Maybe that's the sort of a catatonic stress response. But it is amazing how people get used to a certain state of being.
Yes.
And when you identify, I think that you're stressed. No, I'm not stressed at all. You start looking at all of the parameters that we look at to measure this. And so I think recognizing that stress is a modifiable risk factor, right?
Definitely.
So stress management will help to improve blood chemistry. We know that. And actually, we'll talk about a research study that you've written about a couple of years ago, I think, or a year ago in our blog. So we'll finish up by actually looking at this research study that really talked about when you deal with modifiable risk factors or chronic disease, biomarkers will change. And so we'll talk about that towards the end.
And they'll normalize. It's really going back to normal. We think this is a huge change, but it's just the body trying to come back to homeostasis.
Absolutely. Or what you call allostasis, right?
Allostasis officially, yes.
Yeah.
Sleep too. I wanted to say sleep because I always ask people about sleep because they don't realize they're stressed, but then you start to ask them about their sleep and they're waking up at 2 or 4 in the morning, worrying about certain things. And the sleep itself, if they could get more sleep, they would deal with stress better. And usually, the 6 to 8 hour window, sometimes 7's perfect for people, sometimes 6, maybe 8. But too much sleep or too little sleep is a stressor in and of itself, or it could be a sign of stress.
It's like that's a magic window, right? Of the amount of time. So what would you say that would be, 6 to 8 hours?
Yeah, some of them said 7 exactly was optimal, but a lot of the research, it came up with about 6 to 8, that window, 6 to 8 hours of session. And I say per session because I know some people work at night and they have to sleep during the day, which is stressor in and of itself. But the nurses study, they said 6 to 7 hours per session had the lowest mortality risk. Another study went up to 8 hours, had benefit. So somewhere between that 6 to 8 hour window, and it's got to be restful sleep, because if it's erratic sleep or it's not restful sleep, your body doesn't get that chance to rejuvenate, to restore, to bring back hormonal balance. So it's got to be good quality sleep as well.
So sleep, like you said, is more than just a restful state. It has to be that restorative state because there's a lot of things that happen physiologically during sleep that we may not even be aware of. So cellular repair, brain development, learning, memory processing. And so that's the positives of a restorative state of sleep. But then there are also the negatives, right? So if you don't sleep very well, and if you are someone that has a habit of not sleeping very well, or they have lack of sleep, can really induce some pretty significant neurohormonal changes. So maybe you could talk a little bit about those from the research that you were looking at.
Well, the inflammation too. I was going to say inflammation. But the hormonal changes, it seems to be that metabolic imbalances include like insulin resistance. So a lot of time that's too much insulin. Folks in the cells just don't want to hear about it. They don't want to accept the insulin and the glucose. So insulin resistance is really a hormonal imbalance. Diabetes itself, increased inflammatory markers, a decrease in leptin and an increase in ghrelin and cortisol. And of course, ghrelin increases your appetite. So now you haven't slept enough. You have hormonal imbalances. You're going to eat more. And that leads to weight gain, which can then be its own stressor and an inflammatory state in and of itself. So those hormonal balances are very, very important as well. And people don't think of these things. And I've heard people say like sleep is a waste of time. I'm like, oh my gosh, I think it's one of the most important parts of your day. Just for your body to recover from this crazy world we live in.
Well, there's that old adage, I'll sleep when I'm dead, you know? So it's like, well, maybe you will because you aren't sleeping. You might die a little sooner. But I'm kind of curious because you talked about, obviously, I think people are typically not sleeping well or not getting that restorative state. But there is an interesting U-shaped relationship that I think that you talk about in one of the blog posts. It's about between the duration of sleep and things like cardiovascular risk, indicating that about 8 hours seems to be sort of that magic number.
Right down the middle, yeah. But there was too much is bad.
Yeah, too much. There was that study of, I think, almost 83,000 women in a nurse's health study that suggested that those people who slept 6 to 7 hours per session had the lowest mortality risk. And they made adjustments for age and alcohol and cancer history. And so if the sleep duration with a relative mortality risk after adjustment, so 5 hours or less, you had a 1.15 risk increase, 0.15 increase, right? 6 hours, it was only a 0.01 increase. 7 hours seemed to be the magic number. 8 hours was a 0.12 increase, and 9 hours was a 0.42 increase. So for those of you who are sleeping too long, you might want to take a look at whether that's
find out and address it. But some people might be right. Everything is right for them. Their biomarkers are good. Absolutely. But for some people, if it's a sign of depression, then that could be something that you have to take a look at as well. Or is it 9 hours of restless sleep where you're not really getting good sleep, but you're just staying in bed? So that's definitely something to address if you're in bed.
This next one I think is fascinating because we look at something like homocysteine, which I hope you're all measuring in your patients. It is a modifiable biomarker. You can look at B12 and B6 and those types of B vitamins can really help modify homocysteine. Obviously, there is a genetic component in terms of whether or not you're moving homocysteine in or out of your body.
Cycle.
Tell us a little bit about this NHANES data around sleep and homocysteine. I thought that was fascinating. And also CRP.
Again, it was right in the middle. People who slept for 7 hours had the lowest homocysteine. That was a level of 8.28. So, if that goes up, creeps up anymore. Yeah. Watch out for that. Or find out why, in that case, for someone that started to creep up, and then we'll talk about that in that study, then you want to dig deeper and look into the B12 folate status. But in this case, they had the lowest of everybody, had the lowest when they slept about 7 hours, because homocysteine is inflammatory too. So that's good. That's going to reduce the inflammation compared to those who slept 5 hours or less, 6 hours, 8 hours, or 9 or more. So those who had the 7 hours of good sleep per night had also the lowest CRP and the lowest fasting glucose. So metabolically, it looks like about 7 hours. And again, this is the NHANES data for a large amount of people. I don't have the exact number here, but they do huge studies, as you know. So we're looking down the median or the mean, but it seems like that could be the magic number for a lot of people. And that's just to make people aware that people think, well, I don't need to sleep. I'm going to go to bed at midnight. I'm going to get up at 5 and it's okay for me. And then you start to find out they're drinking a pot of coffee in the afternoon And then they really can't get to sleep until after midnight. And it's really this vicious cycle where they think they're doing okay on 5 hours of sleep, but really they're not. So getting to that magic number can reduce inflammation in the body and reduce
then the
fasting
biomarkers
glucose.
start to change.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the homocysteine goes up, the HSCRP goes up, fasting glucose goes up.
Cortisol
goes up. I mean, I think one of the important things, and you mentioned this in the post, and I think it's important to remember around homocysteine, yes, 8.28 was the mean for people that steps up, but that's still a little bit too high. Because there was a meta-analysis that suggested that the risk of coronary heart disease increases 20 to 50% for each 5 micromoles per liter of homocysteine. Now, if you look at the quote-unquote normal reference range for homocysteine, in Western established allopathic medicine, they tolerate a homocysteine of 15 as being normal. They will only start to think about it as a risk when it's over 15. You know, we like to see it below 7.
And not too low either, right? Between 4 and 7.
Yeah, not too low, because you've got the other part.
And it's part of the cycle.
Another one was, I mean, we keep banging on about sleep, and I do want to point out a great podcast that we did with, I think, Deanna Minich, right, around melatonin and darkness deficiency. So if you want to really kind of dive into the role melatonin plays and darkness deficiency. But another study was an animal study. Now, I usually take animal studies with a pinch of salt, but I think they can be informative. And this one...
They're mammals.
They're
like
mammals,
us.
right. Yeah. But so many of the mice are so genetically modified nowadays, it's almost hard to believe. But anyway, this study revealed that sleep deprivation in mice was associated with multiple organ system damage and characterizes an increase in serum levels of alpha amylase, BUN, CKMB, which is the brain, the muscle portion of creatine kinase, and then just general total CPK, also AST and ALT and LDH and total bilirubin. So impacts on liver enzymes with sleep deprivation.
Just sleep deprivation. Yeah, it's a big thing that people just don't take, you know, they take for granted.
So let's think about this. So we've covered diet, we covered stress, we covered sleep. So one of the things I love about your blog post is your optimal takeaways. So why don't you just run quickly through the optimal takeaways around, you know, what are some of the things that you might, as a practitioner, want to talk to your patients around in terms?
Yeah, and these are the easy things, and it can be one step at a time. If you can get somebody to change one thing a week, sometimes that's, you know, a reward. Then you're successful. But of course, a healthy diet, and I like to encourage people to add things into their diet before they even take things out. Because as soon as you take something away from somebody, obviously they like whatever they're doing. And if you're taking it away, they feel deprived, and then that can be a whole psychological issue. So adding things in is more important. So adding in fresh fruits and vegetables, even like I tell people 2 handfuls of vegetables a day in your meals or snacks and a handful of fruit, especially berries. You have to start with that. That's the bare minimum. Some people don't even eat that bare minimum. So handfuls, I go by handfuls. So a couple of handfuls of fresh vegetables, a handful of fresh fruit. If you're going into whole grains, if you tolerate grains, switch to whole grains for at least half of your choices. Legumes, again, as tolerated, but introducing legumes to salads or soups or having hummus.
Very high in fiber. Regulating blood sugar.
Yes. Too high sometimes. Can be a little gassy, but you can take Beano for that. Right. Nuts and seeds and herbs and spices. Add these things in, again, first before you take anything away. High quality protein, especially lean proteins, especially seafood, especially salmon, wild-caught salmon. That is a great source of omega-3s. Healthy fats, omega-3 fats, extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil is another one. Olives. People always forget that olive oil came from olives. So, olive oil is good for us, and olives are as well. I know they're a bit salty, but I have to have salt. My blood pressure is usually like 90 over 60. It's been 74 over 54 at a health fair. And that's like, how do you feel? I said, I feel fine. And I crave salt. So that's funny. So I like the salty thing. So olives are good for you, and they're actually a fruit. If you have to restrict salt, then just be a little more careful about those. Vitamins and minerals. And a lot of people I find really their diet is deficient, or their exposure to toxins is increased, or their needs are increased for micronutrients. So I'm a big believer in a really good balanced high potency multivitamin mineral supplement. And that's if they're candidates for multivitamin mineral supplements, and most people are. Restful sleep, again, 6 to 8 hours. And if you can't get those 6 to 8 hours, I do recommend a little cat nap, because I do feel like you can catch up. Yeah. And just kind of start your day over again a little bit after a 20-minute nap. Physical activity and structured exercise. Again, of getting into the habit of walking after meals is a great habit all the way around, and having a regular routine at least 3 days a week. If you can have a routine 6 days a week, faithfully 6 days a week, I think that's the best habit. moderation of alcohol intake. And that would be really 1 drink a day, especially for women, no more than that. And 1 drink or 1 alcoholic beverage is the equivalent of 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, or 1.5 ounces of an 80 proof liquor. So people are like, I had just 1 drink, but that was like 17 ounces of wine. Yeah, that was a big glass. So there's actually a definition of 1 drink. Social connections and support. We forget that sometimes, we're on social media, but we're not really connecting with anybody. So really, if face-to-face could be best, or really connections one-on-one instead of with large groups all the time can be helpful. But family gatherings, things like that are precious. Motivation and a sense of purpose was a big deal too. And even if you're just volunteering, doing something productive that you feel like you're doing something is very, very self-fulfilling. And then again, stress management, and incorporate meditation, deep breathing, self-awareness, yoga, or even gentle stretching. Some people are afraid of the word yoga. So you start with gentle stretching. And eventually, I think originally yoga anyway was very much that self-expression. It was very loose. You moved where you felt like you wanted to move. And so I have people do that, and you don't have to call it yoga, just call it gentle stretching to start with. And then eventually they might even move into asanas and they don't realize it.
Yeah.
So those simple things, add a couple of things in each week,
very cool.
Ideally.
So I wanted to finish up, and there's just another blog post you posted on February 16th, 2023. It was called Proof, Modification of Health Behaviors Reduces Chronic Disease Risk. So I wanted to finish up because I think it sort of ties everything that we've talked about into a pretty interesting research study that was done. And we can actually show that when a core group of patients received the coaching and made the changes that were part of the program, they had very, very significant shifts. And one of the things that was measured were blood biomarkers. So this reduction in chronic disease risk and burden in 70 individual cohort through the modification of health behaviors. So this was written by Thomas Lewis and co. And
it was 2020, right? Yeah, it was published in 2020.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this was an interesting research study. So this is a comprehensive study that demonstrated that intensive individualized health coaching and medical guidance could significantly improve disease-based biomarkers and dramatically improve health. What I love about this, it isn't about drugs.
Right.
This is about things that people can modify. And I love the fact that health coaching was a significant part of it, because I think a lot of the practitioners that come to ODX have an aspect of their practice which they consider themselves to be a health coach. Even though you may be a physician by training, ultimately you are to your patients ultimately a health coach. Yeah. There is obviously a designation of health coach that aspires to do that as well. But ultimately, when we have that direct interface with our patients, when we're describing what we're finding, making the recommendations, and then supporting the patient through the changes that need to be made in order for them to significantly improve health, that is a coaching kind of concept. So let's dive into this study a little bit. You know a little bit better than I do. So what were some of the things that kind of stood out for you that really kind of...
Well, the changes that you see in the biomarkers, and then people have to go into the blog to see the pictures, but the pictures of people who had rheumatoid arthritis, the changes in their hands before and afterwards, yes, and psoriasis, the changes before and after. And sometimes the clients, I call them clients here, didn't make all the changes that were recommended, but still had dramatic improvement. And that's where it comes into change. A couple of changes could make a dramatic difference. Just introducing some of these healthier foods, just eliminating some of the toxins, including too much alcohol and smoking, can make a difference. And in this case, in some of these case studies they did, and it was really fascinating, that visual. But what they call it 4P medicine, which I thought was great. They approached it. It's called predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory. Yeah. And the participatory is a big part of it. They had to make some of these changes to see results. And it was the mean, and I took the mean changes before and after the 9-month program. And they had significant improvement in hemoglobin A1C, glucose levels, neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, which is a biomarker of inflammation, HSCRP, again, inflammation, insulin, HDL levels went up, triglycerides came down, vitamin D went up, uric acid came down, white blood cells came down, RDW. What else? We have ESR, fibrinogen, homocysteine was the only weird one. Fibrinogen improved, and then homocysteine didn't. It went up a little bit. So that's again where I think we have to dig into those individuals where it did go up and pull that number, that mean up. Yeah, let's look at their B12 folate status to start with. Maybe do some extensive,
right?
Yes, methylation. Maybe look at their methylmalonic acid. So I would dig into those folks more to see what else is going on with them. And again, sometimes, like people take folic acid and they don't really tolerate it well. So you're not going to get the results you would have gotten if you gave folate. So then you'd have to dig into these folks again that had the higher, where homocysteine went up, find out what's going on with those methylation cycles and the sulfur cycles. But I've really found the dramatic change when we put the numbers into the software and can see the blood biomarker history. And that's always so dramatic when people look at that in there. We go over clients' results with them and you see side by side the changes over that 9-month period. And, they're in the red. And I put it in January 1st, wasn't an exact date, but I used January 1st. And then 9 months later was August. So dramatic differences from being in the red to the green, or at least being in the red back down to being in the yellow, which is maybe out of optimal, but they're really doing very well. And I think that's the big visual. And that's why I went back and put that into the blog post. Yeah, so I think cool.
There was thumbs up for probably 98% of the biomarkers that they changed, which is extraordinary. This is a mean group. So just to kind of give a little bit of background, this was 70 individuals, part of a 9-month disease reversal and prevention program. They looked at individual health parameters as well as serum biomarkers known to reflect the presence and progression of chronic disease. Within the study, health coaches interacted face-to-face or electronically with participants and groups of participants to implement care plans. See, I love the idea of having groups because it provides that social proof and also participatory. It's like, I'm also not alone in the suffering that I'm having, and I'm also not alone in the improvements that I'm making. So I can actually see from my cohort that we're all supporting each other. So coaching activates patients to change through collaborative learning and social supports. That's that group concept. And then they use that 4P medicine approach. The interventions tailored supported the individual's level of activation and build skills and confidence. So really, really cool. So underneath the show notes, we'll put the actual original research paper. We'll put a PDF to that. We'll put a link to the blog post. But if I may, Beth, because I deal with arthritis in my hands, it's a familial thing. Obviously, there are things that I can do to modifiable changes in my lifestyle that probably would have tremendous impact on it. But I wanted to bring this case up because this, to me, when I saw the photographs of this, it is quite breathtaking. So this is case number 2. And so forgive my selfishness to focus on the thing that
let's do it.
So a guy with rheumatoid arthritis and type 2 diabetes, 62-year-old male factory worker with a high school education. He presented with major complaints, including a history of cancer, poor oral hygiene, high carbohydrate intake, high fructose diet, low fat diet, previous history of tick bites, low vitamin D, positive rheumatoid arthritis, severe chronic back and joint pain, and type 2 diabetes. He refused pharmaceutical drugs per his choice. In addition, he almost never participated in traditional healthcare visits. He decided to participate in the study, but was considering adalimumab, which is one of those drugs that you see on television that you can't even pronounce. And you see this person running around happy, and then suddenly you listen to this person telling you all the horrible things that it's going to do to you, and way
side
too fast.
Effects.
The side effects
can be fatal,
including anal leakage and things like that. Anyway, we're going to be over. So he was going to do this drug because he was in constant pain, and he was thinking about, if this study doesn't do anything, then I'm going to do the drug. So the health revival process, I love that, health revival process. That's such a cool term. Health revival process included supplements to match identified deficiencies and a semi-monthly 45-minute coaching session. So this is what the guy, there's a photograph of his hand before, and it's like clenched. You can see severely swollen knuckles. Clearly, this has got to be very painful. And then afterwards, just 6 to 8 months later. So over the first 5 months, the participant lost 25 pounds. Through a reduction in carbohydrate consumption, but with no significant change in daily calorie intake, which I think is extraordinary, just by changing the amount of carbohydrates that were consumed. He also embarked on a substitution diet where over 3 months, gluten-containing foods were removed from his diet. Bing, 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 bing. Probably a great choice. Replaced with vegetables and marine and animal-based fats. He was also put on a modest supplementation program, including cod liver oil, bing, 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 omega-3 index, vitamin D3, 5,000 IUs a day, magnesium glycinate, good absorbable form of magnesium, 400 milligrams a day. He was on vitamin K2, 15 micrograms per day, and a multivitamin and mineral per label instructions. Okay, this is what happened. Type 2 diabetes reversed, as illustrated by his hemoglobin A1C dropping from 8.8 to 5.4. Fasting insulin dropped from 180 to below 90.
Glucose, right? Fasting glucose.
Fasting glucose. 180 to below 90. His pain was substantially eliminated based on a subjective pain score of 8 to 10 initially to 0 to 10 afterwards. His rheumatoid arthritis improved to enable him to bend his fingers into a full fist for the first time in over 5 years. This is just remarkable, one of these 70 people. So anyway, please go check this study out. Go read Beth's blog post because she does a great job sort of really pulling together all of the aspects of this. And I think the take-home message hopefully from this podcast is that even in the face of something as terrible as rheumatoid arthritis that is causing visible changes to your hands and joints and knuckles and type 2 diabetes and all of those things, they are absolutely modifiable.
Yes.
And it doesn't take drugs. Yes. All it takes is the things that we do as functional medicine practitioners, recognizing our role as health coaches, recognizing that we need to activate our patients to change through collaborative learning, social support, helping them build confidence and skills to navigate their lives and make good, healthy choices for themselves.
Yeah.
So,
well, giving the human body what it needs, like you give a car what it needs when you fill it with gas and you change the oil, right? Give your pets what they need. You give your plants what they need. People forget to give the human body what it needs, and it brings it back into balance. It's magical. Magical.
Oh, now I'm just looking at the photograph you got here, Beth, of the psoriasis. So a picture of this, I think it's a woman, a photograph of her fingertips, absolutely just riddled, cracked, broken. This thing has got to be so painful. 5 months later, just by doing, I mean, seriously.
She didn't make all the changes. She was resistant to taking out gluten and dairy, but she made other changes and added cod liver oil and did beautifully. Yeah.
Positive changes. Her 25-hydroxyvitamin D went from 24 to 55. White cell count went from 6.2 to 5.5. RDW from 14.6 to 13. Fibrinogen from 339 to 282. I mean, these are substantial changes that were made.
It's proof, right? That's why I labeled it proof. I say that this is proof. Evidence, but even proof beyond evidence. This is proof. Yeah.
So I love this. I'm just going to read this, the bottom line that you put at the bottom of the blog post. Optimal health and wellness are achievable with the right motivation, the right guidance, and perseverance. And health coaching and personalized lifestyle intervention can play a major role in one's journey to optimal health. So really cool. Well, Beth, thank you so much for writing these blog posts. Like I said, we'll put them in the show notes below. I hope that there's some things in here that you can take away with, but just recognizing that sitting with our patients, listening to their stories, working out what are the things that they're doing in their lives that they can have an impact on that are modifiable, and helping them to institute change, making substitutions where necessary so that they too can start achieving these types of results. I know you're all doing it. We're speaking to the choir, but it's always fun just to kind of remind people that these cases are out there and we can make profound change. So,
proof.
Cool. Any parting words before we quit for the day?
No, just give some people encouragement. That's all they need sometimes to get going. So motivation and encouragement, and off they go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you're interested in what we're doing over at Optimal DX, please come over to optimaldx.com. We've got a very rich resource center. We have 2 blog posts that we do. We do a research blog and we do an optimal blog. We'll put some links below. You can kind of go over and check out some of the things we're doing, download some of our white papers. And if you're at all interested in the type of analysis that we do over in the Optimal DX platform, join. It's $20 a month. We'll give you a membership into the platform. You can engage with us and put in your blood tests and on a report by report basis. You can get a full functional history on your patients. You can build incredible health concern based treatment plans, or you can come in with an unlimited plan as well if you know that you've got a ton of different biomarkers or patient blood tests that you want to enter into the system. But we're here to serve you. I want to thank everyone who does support our work. We wouldn't be here if we weren't supported by our clients and customers. So thank you all for all the work that you do. And thank you, Beth, for all the work you do.
And thank you.
So this is Dr. Weatherby saying thank you so much for listening. Stay well and stay optimal.